Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, one and all. Thanks for joining us in this episode of SKILup Sessions from PeopleCert. Today's topic is about open source toolchain orchestration. Now, before we get started, I want to welcome you all for taking the time today to be with us for the next 1 hour for a great session, which is on a favorite topic on open sources. There's always been a fight outside the world where we say that open source versus proprietary tools, for and against. So we are going to kind of distill some of those thoughts as we start to have this conversation. So my name is Suresh GP. I'm the managing director of Top Solutions based in India, Singapore, and the US. I'm also the global ambassador of the DevOps Institute, focusing on consulting, coaching, and training on DevOps, site reliability engineering, observability, and AOps, right? So I'm very glad to have today our guest, who is Adriana Villela, who is our guest for today. She's been very well known in the industry. She is the senior developer advocate at Lightstep. She focuses on helping companies achieve reliability greatness by leveraging observability, site reliability engineering, and DevOps practices. Before Lightstep, she was a senior manager at Techstrong, running both platform engineering team and observability practices team. Adriana has also worked in various large-scale enterprises in both individual contributor and leadership roles, including Bank of Montreal's Ceridian and Accenture. She's a popular technical blog on Medium, and she is the CNCF ambassador, as well as an HashiCorp ambassador, joining us all the way from Toronto. Thank you so much, Adriana, for taking time today to be with us in this episode.
Thanks for having me. Really excited about this conversation.
Right. So for all of viewers, I want to set the context of why we are doing this episode, right? In terms of a lot of organizations that we see, we talk a little bit about tool chains. The DevOps tool chains are highly complex and often heterogeneous, right? Basically, you have different individual tools from different vendors and developers, and they need to be orchestrated if you are trying to build a CI/CD pipeline. And as your team automates and build and test, you need to also look at, are you doing it in the most effective manner, right? So in a lot of organizations, as we start to see consulting and coaching, we see open source can bring a lot of value to the orchestration perspective with a powerful creative community collaboration, because that's how open source is created, part of it, with passion and expertise. We'll talk a little bit about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So that's the context that we're going to talk about. So Adriana, why don't you kick us out as part of how long has this been, this open source? When did it kind of originate for us? I mean, for a little bit of background, when we started to have DevOps in 2009 in the Velocity conference, from there, where was the genesis of open source and where was the need felt for building this open source community? It would be good to get a little bit of a history and background for people to understand a little bit better, right?
I don't know if I'm the right person to ask about the history of open source. I am a user of open source and benefactor of open source. For me, I feel like it's just, obviously it had it originated at some point. For me, I feel like it's always been there. Obviously, it hasn't.
Sure.
Yeah.
Good. So now let's talk a little bit about the setting of the part around the open source toolchain orchestration. Now, before we kind of start with, we wanted to look at if I'm building a CI/CD pipeline, and a lot of viewers are as part of DevOps and building it. The first people think about open source is it's probably economical, it's cheap, it's free. So is that true that anything around open source is cheap and free and easy? What is your first part of doing it? Because there might be some myths, but I wanted to kind of make that a conversation, because let's start with the basics to just make sure everybody in the group are understanding that part. So what's your take on open source as a feeler?
Yeah, I guess the answer is it depends, right? Because say you're a startup, right? You are low on cash, awesome open source tools out there available for you. take advantage of that, right? Which is great, and especially if you're like you leveraging a more mature open source tool, I think that can be extremely beneficial. But there's also I would say, a hidden cost associated with it, which is time, right? Where you're working with a non-open source tool, you're paying somebody for support. So if something goes wrong with the tool, you can contact support and say, hey, help me out. With open source, it's a little bit different, right? You're relying on the community to help you out, right? So then while you're saving, the money that you would have paid for a non-open source tool and perhaps on support, you are investing extra time. And sometimes, depending on how mature the open source tool is, it might be like you have to dig in and debug the tool yourself and maybe submit a pull request.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to do it. And a lot of people think that open source is literally free, but I think the most important power of the open source is about to customize and kind of look at it at a code level to make changes, because a lot of times the proprietary tool vendors will not give you access to go at the code level for want of their IP rights, which is understandable. So that's an opportunity to kind of bring that out. Now, let's also talk a little bit about the CNCF part of it, because I know that open source is heavily now built with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So give us a little bit of background on that purpose, because I think this is relating it to that overall open source toolchain philosophy. How do you see the Cloud Native Computing Foundation playing a pivotal role in this overall open source market?
Well, the way I look at it is CNCF, when you're an organization, for example, and you decide to open source a tool, it's under that organization's purview, right? Which can be a bit of a slippery slope, right? Because it could mean that organization is responsible for the bulk of the maintenance around it, even if you have like the occasional contributor and whatnot. But then when it's under the umbrella of an organization like CNCF, now you kind of have that, you might have like some main organizations that might contribute, but it's under this bigger umbrella. So it doesn't belong to any particular organization. So it makes it a little bit more neutral. And I think it protects the source code, but it keeps it open source, if you will, right? So there's less risk of someone going and saying, hey, you know what, I don't want this to be open source. Or, in the case of HashiCorp, where they're the main owners of their open source tools. So they can do what they did, which is basically restrict the licensing.
Right. And in terms of the benefits, like a lot of times, as you rightly said, one of the things is about there's going to be a consumption of time. There's going to be a level of expertise that is required on that. So to just get started off, for anybody who's evaluating on an open source platform, an open source set of tools, what are some of these advantages they would stand to gain when they start thinking about open source? Why would they need to really pull up to go towards open source? What are some of the significant benefits to start with?
Well, I think if a tool is relatively mature, then you can like really lean on a very robust community for support. So like take Kubernetes, right? Huge community around that. So many contributors from different places. You are surely going to encounter somebody in the Kubernetes community who can help you out if you get stuck in something, or even open telemetry, which is what's near and dear to my heart. I work with open telemetry folks on a daily basis. Same sort of thing. It's a very diverse, robust community, very active, and because of that, even for myself, like I'm researching on certain topics in open telemetry that I'm not super familiar with. I can go on to the various Slack channels and ask questions, and there's always going to be somebody who's going to answer the question. So you benefit from that because there's always going to be somebody who's going to be able to help you out in some respect, which is really nice.
And I think it's a great point that you mentioned about that mind share of people who are experts, who are doing day in and day out solving problems. It's like a peer mentorship, just going there and nudging them gently and saying, hey, what is happening around in this space? Can we kind of look at it? It's going to be another patch or some of those code that we need to repurpose it to aspect of making it work. That makes a lot of sense. Now, in terms of starting about DevOps, right? And if you want to build a DevOps tool chain using open source components, where do you kind of get started? You know, where is, because we have a big pipeline of the code, build, test, deploy phase. Where do you think we should start thinking about? Should we use all the open source and build a particular thing? And how would someone navigate to setting up a pipeline, CI/CD pipeline using open source platforms?
So I would say your best friend in that case is Google, because it'll give you an inkling of like, you can Google like popular open source, CI/CD tools.
Right.
You'll surely come up with something. I'm sure Jenkins will be top of the list kind of thing, right? So that's a really great starting point, and kind of get a feel for it. It'll give you a feel for like what people are using out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of things that we kind of get into practice. Like we have something like Jenkins when you actually look at your CI server. There's a lot of other tools that we are seeing in terms of monitoring, like Prometheus. We are looking at some of like ELK as a ELK part of it. We are looking at Terraform in part of how we kind of HashiCorp Terraform.
Yeah.
Kind of given back to CNCF. Is that true that the HashiCorp Terraform is still with them, or is it now loaned to the community of the open source?
So HashiCorp Terraform is still with HashiCorp, but I believe there's a fork of Terraform called OpenTF. I don't know who owns it right now, but I'm guessing the intent is for it to be fully open source, for those folks who weren't so happy with the direction that HashiCorp took. Right.
And in terms of feedback, and you touched a little bit about open source, open telemetry. Let's talk a little bit about it. So one of the challenges that we have with site reliability engineers, as they start to look at infrastructure monitoring, they're looking at application performance monitoring, they have all these tools in place, but they still struggle, right? Because the observability part becomes very, very difficult to manage. So what's your take on the open telemetry that could help people in the pipeline to leverage, considering they might have their own set of tools managing infrastructure, application performance? So how does open telemetry help them in that journey?
So open telemetry, it's actually quite interesting with regards to open telemetry and CI/CD, because you can observe your CI/CD pipelines. Now, there's a lot of people have talked about observability of CI/CD pipelines. However, there isn't actually that much stuff around it. Now, there is some support here and there. I believe there is a Jenkins plugin for OpenTelemetry. And a few people have created plugins for like GitHub Actions plugins as well to provide that observability. But there hasn't been, beyond, as far as I know, beyond the Jenkins one, like nothing official that's either been, coming from the OpenTelemetry community or from GitHub itself. But I hope that we can start seeing more and more of that, because I really do think it's so important, especially as our pipelines get more and more complex, right? I think when a pipeline is functioning fine, it's one of those things where you're like, awesome, I can just, let it do its thing and I don't have to worry. But what happens when something goes awry, right? Like even in, for open telemetry contributions, I do a lot of docs contributions. They have a GitHub Actions pipeline set up for that. And I swear, because they have like all these different checks, I swear to God, there's like always something when I push my code, something breaks in the pipeline, and then I'm having to go and dig through the various logs for each of the components, seeing what is it in it. Usually like some sort of linter or whatever that I didn't check when I was doing things locally. And I think being able to have like these plugins in our like native OTel plugins and our CI/CD tooling would be super, super helpful, so that, we're not having to go to different pieces here and there to figure out what the hell's going on, right? You can just send everything to your observability backend. You can be like, oh, that's where it got messed up. Okay, now I can start looking.
No, that's a great one. And I think for for people who have just viewers who just logged in into that particular session for us, I definitely ask you to look at CNCF and Open Telemetry. There's a whole lot of things going on, and you know where to look out for Adriana. She would be there as part of talking with people of open source experts on that. So a little bit of on the aspect of inhibition for a lot of our clients when we talk about open sources. Oh, what happens to security? The open source part, when we start to impose open source code into our repository, who's going to do the code check and balance, vulnerabilities, threats? So how do you kind of typically address that kind of a question, which is a very legitimate question, particularly when we do a lot of the financial services? There's a lot of people are very hesitant to look at open source purely from a security standpoint. So how is the open source market trying to address the security aspects? What has been your experience confronting that, particularly when an organization wants to get a board approval to go ahead and get approved the open source tools?
Well, so I worked for a financial institution for 11 years, and I can tell you that the resistance to open source tooling is very high because exactly of those concerns around security. And also the other major thing is the fact that they want to be able to throw money at somebody for support. So, you know, instead of like going with Jenkins, they'll go with CloudBees, right? Because that's the, you know, the enterprise arm of it. So then that kind of gives them that security blanket that there's been the extra stuff that's been taken care of to address any security concerns. So in some ways, that's kind of your workaround, if you will, in the enterprise scenario, is if you have like some sort of enterprise backer of an open source tool, I do feel that it kind of starts to quell some of those concerns.
Yeah, I think that's true too, in a certain extent. For people who have joined in, as we start to have this conversation, this is kind of a fireside chat that we are doing to look at some of the commonly asked questions in terms of open source tools chain orchestration. But do you have any specific questions, please put it on the Q&A, and I will actually pick it up as we start to go through this. I have some question that has come up in the previous past around a lot of things to do with licensing, vulnerability, and support perspectives. So how does it work in an open source kind of an environment? I know that one is for my experimentation basis that I want to do, but if I want to do a commercial version, right, and I'm trying to do leverage the open source tools here to build my ecosystem. So how does the licensing aspect works, support aspect works? Can I kind of have a wrapper to support me on when I go there to do something of open source? How does licensing, vulnerabilities, and support? What would be the good way to take this into overall consideration before making a decision?
I guess it really depends on the licensing for the open source tool in terms of like, do they support you basically creating an enterprise wrapper around it?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's making sure that whatever you're doing is cool from a licensing perspective.
Right. So let's talk a little about some of the tools that are kind of popular in the market in terms of the open source. So let's talk about the big one about Kubernetes, right? So a lot of these aspects that we are talking about with people is about orchestration, the container orchestration, the way that we are looking at parts. So how much of a significant bearing has Kubernetes had held completely because of the way of pushing towards scalability and reliability as a very important aspect? How is Kubernetes, the K8 that we call popularly, has stepped up the game? And what is in store for people to expect from something like Kubernetes, which becomes a very de facto tool in most of the container orchestration?
Yeah, I mean, Kubernetes is pretty ubiquitous. And even though there's like other players out there like HashiCorp Nomad and I think VMware Tanzu and all that.
OpenShift and all of those.
Yeah, OpenShift. And OpenShift is basically like a managed opinionated Kubernetes. So again, taking advantage of and it's actually super perfect for enterprises, right? Because it's like this abstraction layer, and it even has like a bunch of custom resources that abstract over top of some of that complexity of Kubernetes, so that, you know, if you don't want to deal with the extra Kubernetes complexity, OpenShift ends up being like this wonderful little option, right, for getting started with Kubernetes. But I mean, Kubernetes is so ubiquitous, and so many organizations have adopted it. But it is a complex tool, right? So then that's why you have like the OpenShifts of the world, or you've got the managed Kubernetes offered by most cloud providers, because yes, you can run Kubernetes in your data center, but why? Because it is a very complex undertaking, right?
Correct. And then also the other one that is popular for a lot of our clients globally is about the ELK stack, right? We're talking about Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. So how does that play, particularly because we are a lot more into SRE's world, where we talk a little bit about the whole aspect of monitoring to observability and trying to look at metrics, events, logs, and traces. So how is ELK being perceived in the market? Because these are popular tools I think everybody should be aware if they're looking at open source and the power of it. How has that been really adopted in many organizations?
I mean, I have worked at an organization where the ELK stack was popular. Working in more of the observability open telemetry space, where observability is more of a trace first approach.
Right.
I think there's still room for the ELKs of the world, especially like with open telemetry. Now the logging specification is more or less locked in, I believe. And so now that means that we've got that nice integration. So now like logs are playing now with our traces as well. So we've got our log trace correlation, which is really nice. Right. But I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with ELK, so I can't speak to it that much, other than I know that it's still really popular. People are definitely still using it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Diana. Now, a lot of people are asking, is the other proprietary vendors supporting open source tools? So how does typically, and you come from a vendor part of Lightstep and stuff. So how do you see the participation of collaboration between the proprietary tool vendors towards open source tools? Because I think there has to be some level of synergy, considering that if you coexist between a composition of open source tools and vendor related tools. So is there a good, healthy market towards building it? Is there a substantial market share for people to think about both can coexist and it's not a cannibalistic approach versus one versus the other?
Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, it really depends on the community. So we've been lucky in open telemetry. I think it's been crafted very deliberately, like how the community was constructed. And I believe that open telemetry, its structure as far as how the community is structured is based on the Kubernetes structure. So you have basically competing vendors working together. So for example, I'm part of the open telemetry end user working group. I'm one of the co-chairs for it. And the other two co-chairs are from competing observability vendors. And what I love about this community is that we check our vendor hats at the door because our common goal is open telemetry. The idea being, we want to standardize on open telemetry. We're not, and so the thing that makes the vendors stick out is, at the end of the day, open telemetry is data. So how does the vendor differentiate themselves? How they render the data? Do they render the data in a way that's useful to how you troubleshoot?
Yeah, no, I think I love this one because I wanted to ask this topic and you brought it in, because a lot of time you have your own vendor hat as part of working in a company, but when you come to this open source, it's a much liberating feeling, I would say, because you are having the best minds who work for the best companies come over, share a common aspect. So is there a kind of a conflict of interest, Adriana, in terms of within your own company, when you start to contribute to open source, is there a kind of a clause that tells you that you can do, you cannot do it, or because you need to get an endorsement of the company, right? At the end of the day, hold about it. So how does it work? Because I think that's a very curious question that I wanted to ask you, because a lot of times I think because I run a company and I understand, there are IP rights and stuff like that, and we don't want you to kind of, obviously with bound non-disclosure agreements, you do not share the intellectual property, but it's a kind of a dicey thing, right? You go there to public platform and talk over. So how is it that perceived from an organization perspective of allowing people to go there and network with other fellow competitors on the open source platforms?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question, because the answer to that is it depends. So, for example, when I worked at a bank, open source, contributing to open source was not a thing.
Right.
And like they had like security concerns and whatnot, and all that. Answer to shareholders, like they wanted to protect themselves legally.
Right.
But then conversely, where I'm at, basically when I took the job, one of the things that I loved about the role is that part of the role included contributing to open telemetry. So one of the awesome things about the observability vendors who, and I would say it's most of them at this point who support open telemetry. I think most of the observability vendors right now have some sort of team dedicated to working in open telemetry. So we actually have an open telemetry team at my company, and they will work on specific components of open telemetry. So it's literally part of their jobs, which is great. So we don't have that concern of like, oh my God, am I, violating some sort of corporate policy, which is nice, compared to like, it's a very different beast when you're working for a financial organization. Because it depending on the culture of the organization and just in terms of how scared they are, in terms of concerned they are in terms of risk exposure, they might keep you from making open source contributions, even doing conference talks, even going on podcasts, that sort of thing, right? It really depends.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the intent about these companies is to bring the best out of the thought process, because we're all on a mission to solve real world customer problems, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter of XYZ tool. All that matters is how are we solving the real world issues. And that's important for all of us to understand that we have an opportunity to serve the customers, right? As part of your role in whatever divisions that we are doing it, we should take that opportunity to apply some of those elements back to that workplace, right? Now, the next question that we have as part of getting through this overall element is in terms of challenges, right? Let's talk a little bit about challenges in working with, let's say you have a proprietary tool set. Let's say within the CI/CD pipeline, I have Jenkins as part of my, I have GitHub or Bitbucket as my source code repository. I have CI server as Jenkins. Then I have SonarQube for me to do your static code analysis part of it. But then suddenly I then kind of look at Excel release or udeploy or some of those tools to do that. So when you're trying to orchestrate this whole toolchain aspects from the left to right, how much of a support can we get from the community? Particularly, it's probably known, and sometimes people create their own unique pipelines. So how does that work in terms of supporting and getting this orchestrated quickly? Is open source toolchain orchestration a lot more quicker than what we think, or is going to be do's and don'ts that you would advise when you do something around open source toolchain orchestration?
I would say the main thing around open source toolchain orchestration is making sure that there's like a robust community behind it, but also making sure that the docs are good enough, right? Because we all know how difficult and sometimes annoying it is to document things, right? We have amazing developers out there who will write some kick-ass code for said open source tool, but when it comes time to document, sometimes it's just difficult to get that information out of your brain and onto paper, right? And so I would say the documentation part is a real challenge when it comes to tool chain orchestration, right? Especially when you're talking about, daisy chaining various open source tools together, because first of all, the documentation might be poor. Secondly, there might be some really weird use case that, of course, you're the one who's like got you're the first one to do this really weird use case. No one else has done it. So, being able to find a way to get the support for the gnarly use cases without necessarily anyone having encountered those gnarly use cases can be very challenging. And sometimes it means like picking out at like little bits of documentation here and there. But I think your tool sometimes is only as strong as the documentation and the community behind it.
Excellent point. And I think for a lot of us, we are very focused on coding something, completing it, rather than just spending time and doing documentation. Because when I used to be a software developer, back the days in 2001, I was a Java J2 developer. I used to hate documentation, right? I just want to get this piece of code shipped out quickly. I don't need to want to spend time and write down an indentation and stuff. So is that a kind of a cultural change that we need to bring in for developers? Because developers are wanting to ship code faster, and they are let me be very honest, that they are into a definitive aggressive timeline in terms of my sprint release and stuff like that. So they don't really have time to build that documentation, or it's kind of at the last minute. Okay, if we have time, we will see that. Otherwise, we just go on. Is that what you see predominantly in all the developer community as you start to interact with a lot of people?
Yeah, I would say both open source and non-open source, or even internal documentation, as you said, like you're writing, proprietary code for your company, and documentation is the thing that falls by the wayside. And what I would say is, like it happens, right? It's really hard to keep documentation up to date. But my advice to you would be as follows. So I'll give you an example. I was researching some stuff on OpenTelemetry. There's a component that I wanted to understand, and I'm going through the docs. I'm like, oh my God, this thing, like I don't get it. I'm reading it over and over and over, and I'm bugging people on CNCF Slack asking for clarification. And I'm like, okay, finally I understand. So I wrote up a blog post explaining how this thing works. Great, super helpful. But then I thought to myself, okay, that's good, but I should also be contributing back to the docs, because at the end of the day, OpenTelemetry docs or whatever other open source tool docs should be the source of truth. And so if you as a user of that tool find something that isn't explained properly, and you have a good way of explaining it or have an understanding, you spent the time digging in to try to understand it, do yourself and everyone else a favor and contribute back to the documentation, because open source contribution isn't just about contributing to the code. It's also about contributing to the documentation, and contributing to the documentation shows a real understanding for how the tool works.
No, that's great to hear. But tell me, this is a very important part that you brought in. You not only simplified it by writing a blog, but also you took the time to go there and do it. But what motivates you, Adriana? Because I want to see people like you coming in large number to support. But this is kind of a rare breed, right? Because you have your day job, you have your personal commitments to do it, but you still find time to not only spend time on community, but also contributing back. So what does it take for someone like you to be so passionate about beyond just your work and paychecks and personal commitments to go to that? There has to be something which is driving you, because I think this is important for all of us who are hearing about why they need to contribute and what value do you get by doing such kind of a community service.
Yeah, so I would say, like, for me, one thing that makes me really happy is to be able to, like, once I understand a concept, to be able to share it with other people. Because my thought is, oh my God, I went through hell trying to get this. Like, I do not want somebody else to go through that same hell. Right. So I'd say that's the main driver. But then the other thing too is this understanding that, like, it's awesome that there are so many blog posts and whatnot out there for various open source tools. And I think that's super, super useful. I mean, Medium for me was a treasure trove of blog posts for understanding things. But I think we need to understand too that for the tools, the open source tools that we know and love, in order for their docs to be the source of truth for those tools, we need to be able to take the time and make the docs updates, and not just get mad like, these docs are a piece of crap, nobody's updating them. No one's updating it, then why don't you do it? I think when there's a really good community to back the open source tool, where you see people are like very receptive to these kinds of contributions, I think it makes it easier and easier to continue to contribute in that way. If it was some sort of community where people are just like hostile and not nice, and like you send a pull request and they're like judgy and mean, like, no thanks, I'm not going to contribute anymore. But every time I submit a pull request, I'm shaking in my boots, but everyone's always super nice and makes very thoughtful comments, so it makes it a lot easier to contribute.
Excellent. I think that's a very important part to do it. One of the things I do is the SRE practitioner series, right? We interview practitioners, and I definitely want to interview you because you are passionate about the open delivery and observability space of it, because I think we should contribute back to the community. And in all perspective, we have gained a lot by this community. In whatever way we are doing our current jobs, it's also important to give back to the community in whatever format to do that. So if you are listening, one of the things that I would suggest is that go and start being a part of CNCF as a member, because that will be a good starting point to do that. So now shifting gears towards the softer aspects of it is the culture part of it, right? We all know that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, the biggest challenge for a lot of companies, which are traditionally companies which are risk averse, they kind of start looking down and say that we don't want to go to open source. There's a lot of pushback on saying that we don't think that open source is the right way to do it. And without even trying to do an experimentation or a pilot to do that. And it's so much ingrained as part of their philosophy that it's so much difficult to push it and then say, you know what, it's not that too bad. Let's try to see in a couple of projects or pilots to do that. So if someone of a company that you go there and they are kind of very non-receptive to tell it in a polite way, if they are non-receptive towards an open source toolchain aspects, what would you do? What would be your initial part of how would we supposed to approach that kind of situation?
I think the easiest argument to make, so I too come from a Java background, and I remember those J2EE servers from back in the day. So this actually makes me think of something that happened in my old banking days, which is, I was at some architecture review board meeting, and they're like, you want to use this open source tool and that open source tool. And then, and they're like poo-pooing all the open source tools. And I'm like, you use Maven and Gradle for building your Java code. And they're like, what? It's open source? What? So, I mean, I feel like that is the surefire argument to shut anybody up, because it's like, guess what? Some tools that you depend on, like there is no other alternative. It's open source.
Correct. No, absolutely. I think that's important for all of us to think about. And for us also, one of the things about toolchains is, right, there is a part of what we call as the element of picking tools. So would you advise not to pick, we always tell this one, let's not pick every tool with the same basket, right? Let's not put all the eggs into one basket. So is that a kind of a best practice of picking up tool chains or picking up tools that will integrate as part of your pipeline of how they want to do it? I know that there is a lot of, it depends part of it, but just for someone to go through that particular journey of, reviewing all the tools that are in the market, you have a periodic set of tables of tools, you can get lost immediately as part of it. So is that a part that you have seen how organizations will go about picking up the tools that are appropriate for the different lifecycle stages, or any thoughts on that? And how do you start the journey of picking up the right tools for the right purpose?
I think for picking those tools, it really starts with, looking at what tools are the most mature ones in the market, because those are the ones that probably have like a pretty robust community behind them. But also, especially if you're talking about toolchain orchestration, probably have the most number of integrations, which means you don't have to write your own integrations, which is awesome.
Correct. So you touched on a very important part of integrations. Like today, a lot of things are by API calls, right? So every product is being attached to another part using an application program interface call to do that. So how tight is this integration part when it comes to the open source? Is that a prerequisite for every open source to have some popular integrations already available from with the popular tools? Is that a part of a mandate that you would do when you design something of an open source ecosystem? Is that something that is a part of their mandate to bring in
I would
integration?
I would say the integration is definitely like a very, very favorable thing, because especially if you're like eyeing a particular set of tools, knowing that they play nice with each other means that you're not going to have to be spending some time troubleshooting those integrations. Or if there's some sort of like plugin architecture where you can easily write a plugin, or as you said, like there's an API call that you can make that makes it easy to make those integrations possible. So whether it's like a formal, like, written for that tool plugin or some sort of API integration, I think just having that handy goes a really long way, because, I think as you mentioned earlier, like having to learn all these different tools can be like, it's a headache, right?
Right.
There is a learning curve. Once you learn it, great, but there is an initial learning curve. So how about making that learning curve a little less painful by having some little convenience aspects to those tools?
Right. And a lot of people who I train, coach, consult as an organizations ask us, we need to build capability on these tools, right? So what would be a good source of learning these tools? Is it part of, is this open source, environment provide people to learn these tools on their own? Is that part of a particular a group that trains people on some of these open source tools? Or what would be the best way to learn and pick up knowledge on these tools? Including lab access to play around and dirty themselves to see how they can get confidence. What are the options available for aspirants who would want to pick up skills on these open source tools?
Yeah, so I would say the docs are always a really good starting point. The other great starting point is like go to that tools GitHub repo and see if they have an examples folder, because that goes a really, really long way. Like sometimes I've been scratching my head trying to figure out, I could really use an example of this. And then I find the examples folder. I'm like, oh, that's how it works, right? Correct. And then blog posts. If the tool has a good, robust community around it, maybe you'll find some posts in that tool's own blog, or it's popular enough that enough people from the community have users of it have blogged to their personal blogs and whatnot.
Sure. And is there a platform, Adriana, in terms of a lab access? We used to have something called as an infra garage where we'll put all of those tools that they can actually play around and part. Is there a kind of a open source community which just says, okay, it's your playground, let's go there and play, let's understand each other? Is that something on the wish list? I'm just thinking loud. It would be great to have these tools kind of brought in a particular way that people can play around in a dev environment or a staging environment that they can just play out. Is that a part of a playground to play on some of those popular tools within the open source community?
That would actually be really cool to have. I know, like, for example, there's this open source tool that I know of. So this is from like the HashiCorp side of things called HashiCube. And it's basically this tool that in the same way that in Kubernetes, like there's Kubernetes that you can run on your desktop, right? Rather than through a cloud provider. There's HashiCube basically lets you run all the Hashi tools together in like a container. So it uses Vagrant to spin up a if you have an M1 machine, it's basically spins up a Docker container that runs Nomad, Vault, Console, and a bunch of other tools that all play nice together, and allows you to basically run the equivalent like Nomad setup that you would normally run in your data center. So there, and this is a tool that was created by like like a person who doesn't work at HashiCorp, but it's something that they created, which is super cool. The person's name is Rion Nolan, and so he created HashiCube, which is really awesome. So there are tools out there that people have created for these types of like little development environments where you can play around. Another one that I discovered that I'm using is GitHub code spaces, where you can basically say you have like a repo, an example repo for whatever. You've got like a little example app for OpenTelemetry, right? You can create a code space that's pre-configured with all the stuff that you want, where people can basically it'll have like all the tools installed that you want. And then people, I believe if you create like your project as a, your repo as like a template repo, then anyone can take that and create a code space off of your repo, and it'll be pre-configured with all the goodies that you need if you want to play around. Now, it does require that people make the time to set these things up, but I hope that people will be inspired by this type of thing, and maybe go and create some like little playgrounds where we can play around. I guess the challenge with these types of playgrounds, especially when it comes to open source, is that you got to pay for these things, right, to be running somewhere, right? So it's going to be paying for the compute for running these things in a playground environment. So then that becomes a bit of a trickier thing, because open source, you're not flush with cash necessarily. So
Yep. No, I think that's a great part that you talked about, Rian Nolan, the person who's kind of contributed, and also the code space that you talked about. Very interesting, very valuable, because you're in neck deep into that, and I can see that passion kind of flowing all over the place. Now, a lot of times, I think when we talk with customers, partners, and people, they say that we need some education. We need some education on what to go about, whether it's an open source or proprietary. So is there a person whom we can reach out to, or is there a part of a body that comes and tells what is the value of, let's say, Kubernetes or ELK or open telemetry in a more about a community sharing initiative, right? Because it could be for an organization that they want to look at, should we go ahead or not go ahead? Will it work? Will it not work? They have some kind of frequently asked questions, if I might post, but then they don't want to go into a Medium or a Slack channel to do that. They wanted to make it more private because they don't want to be getting exposed. So is that also an option available for organizations to get leverage with some of those people like you and people who are in that open community to come there and share their best practices on a complementary basis, right? You just are sharing of telling people this is that. Is that an avenue that organizations can leverage for their benefits?
I think that is something that organizations can leverage. Like, I was at an organization at one point where we were trying to convince folks to use a particular tool, and it was open source, and they were like, well, it's not mature enough. And I'm like, trust me, you will want to use this. And so I got in touch with a couple of people that I knew who worked in that open source space, and I got them to come in and basically do a Q&A at the company that I was working at the time. So I think those, sometimes it's a matter of like knowing who to contact. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Like or a chicken and the egg, right? You kind of have to be in the community to know who to get in touch with. I think CNCF has the ambassador program. And so CNCF ambassadors are passionate about the various CNCF tools, and they will specialize in particular CNCF tools that are near and dear to their hearts. And I can say that I think on the CNCF website, for example, there is a list of all the current ambassadors, and I believe it lists like what their main area is. So that could be a really great way of just getting in touch with somebody who can give you a little bit of guidance in the community, especially around a particular open source tool that tickles your fancy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to do it. So if you're looking out for someone, and we do organize, Adriana, for our clients an expert talk session where we bring in experts who are passionate about it, who are in the weeds, if I would say, or doing it day in and day out in the trenches, to come there and share their best practices. And it's so much enlightening because they are not talking theoretical, they're talking about use case scenarios. And a lot of developers are able to relate to them on the world because they see the same blood coming from both ears and saying that, okay, it's the same kind of a trauma, the complaint that we have had, and it's something so much effectively, right? So we have got 10 minutes to go. I'm just looking at people, if you are on the chat who are watching this one, if you are going ahead, please shoot out the questions to Adriana and me. We'd be more than happy to kind of get through this. But as we start to see and act on some of these stuff, how much of these webinars help people, right? Because a lot of times these webinars, like the People Cert, SKILup sessions that's hosted by Techstrong, is focusing on giving back something to the community. So are people kind of sick and tired of all these webinars, or they still see value in these webinars? I just want to get a devil's advocate about from people. So people who are just on the chat, do you see value from what we've been discussing so far? Because I think we want to really get your feedback, because every session that has been hosted by the SKILup sessions is primarily focusing on what value are we trying to bring to the audience. We are trying to get an intake process to look at some of the popular topics to see how we can make that work. So please take some time to fill in the survey that Cody Brown actually has posted. And thanks to Cody, he's joining from city of Austin, Texas. So it's pretty late for him. It's in Central Standard Time. And that's the kind of passion that we have with people globally, that they all look at a common purpose to contribute. Now, for all of us, as we start to see through it, what would be our next steps if we want to go into the journey? So, Adriana, in terms of the overall open source market, open source community, what does the future look like from close quarters? You've been watching this whole CNCF from close quarters as an ambassador, and a lot of people are wanting to know things. But one thing that people ask me always about this AI, right? This generative AI, open AI, chat GPT, how is that going to be spinning out in an open source kind of an environment? And how do you leverage, or how do you think with all this all of movement towards AIOps, machine learning, what is going to be in store for us to expect from the open source community? And I know that it's a broader statement, but I'm just trying to identify if you see or smell some smoke coming out of this open community, particularly with large push towards AI.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely a hot topic these days. I would say look at AI as a friend, not foe, and
Right.
and to look at AI as like something to assist you with your day-to-day job, right? Because at the end of the day, we still need the humans to vet the things that the AIs come up with, but sometimes AI can do stuff that way better than we can. So leveraging, and so I do think that we are going to see in the open source community AI being leveraged in an assistive fashion, which, hey, anything that can make my life easier, I'm happy to do that. I will happily embrace it.
Right, absolutely. I think to kind of make this part working, the whole point of thing, and I'm going to kind of put Adriana's Adriana, you would want to put your LinkedIn in the chat so that people can stay connected with you. With
Yeah,
7
sure.
minutes to go, I wanted to kind of tell people about our next session that's been planned on the September the 12th. So which is on best practices for open source aspects. So this is actually going to be in the chat, but I just wanted to put this for everybody. So in the SKILup session program, there's the next step is going to be on September 12th, which we're going to talk a little bit about open source software tool integration. So I think you should probably take advantage of that and register. And there's a lot of these sessions are focused on delivering absolute value to all of you in terms of applying some of those best practices. So this is a platform where we are passionate ambassadors who come there and share real world experiences. I hope that you are able to get a lot of value from this particular session with Adriana. And Adriana did a great job to answer a lot of diversified questions that came over. And it was like, we didn't know it's almost on the top of the hour. And it was such a fascinating discussion, bringing your real world experience.
Well, thank you. I had lots of fun. This was a great topic.
Yeah, excellent. So for people who just looked at it, I would definitely want you to go there and register for the upcoming sessions with People Cert. SKILup sessions. I hope, Cody, you would be able to put that in terms of the options where we have, and that could be a part of how we can make that work. So some feedback here from Alberto Suji from Nigeria. Great session with amazing insights. Thankful to you, Duo. And thank you so much for joining. It's pretty early, Adriana, to just give you, it's close to about 5 o'clock in the morning now, which means they would have logged around 4 o'clock in the morning. So we have passionate people around people joining in. I had one more person, Udemy Okon from Nigeria. We have a lot of people, but it just shows me participants 645. But if you're there still in the session, please put your names and from which location are you dialing in, because we want to give a shout out to all the people who made time and effort to do it. Thanks, Cody. There is a link for a registration for the September 12th event that we just talked about in terms of open source software tool integration, because you need to keep learning, right? I wanted to leave with one thought with everyone here. Continuous upskilling and learning, unlearning, and relearning is going to be very important. We were actually in a workshop yesterday in Nigeria, and a lot of folks were asking, how do you build a growth mindset? And one of the things that resonated with everybody was the factor of learning, unlearning, and relearning. Because a lot of us come from a lot of experience, saying we have our own baggage called experience baggage to carry on. But I think we should know that we do not have all the answers. Like what Steve Jobs says, if you go to the conference room looking at you are the smartest person, then you are in the wrong room. So I think come out in this particular sessions, it is also important to be grounded and connect with your own fellow colleagues, cohorts, to share insights and brainstorm and be a part of groups and sessions and forums that you can contribute, but also ask questions, because I think the best way to learn a lot of these stuff is to connect with people, and people are pretty magnanimous to share their real world experience. So just stay connected with Adriana, stay connected with me, stay connected with PeopleCert and Techstrong, because these are people who are on a mission to help people to learn, upskill, and get benefits. I hope this would be useful. If you enjoy the session, please fill the feedback, provide your feedback on the session and the chat, and also invite your friends to register for the session. They can, as I'm told with Cody, that if you want to listen to this session on demand, you should register for the link that you actually joined, so that everybody gets an opportunity to listen. I know that we are in different time zones and we all have our own preferences, but it will be a great opportunity to go there and listen to things, and more importantly, put some things into your practice, right? So any final thoughts, Adriana, before we kind of let everybody go on the future of open source and toolchain orchestration?
Yeah, I would say, open source is only as strong as its community. And, if there's an open source tool that's near and dear to your heart, and especially if the docs aren't so great, the best way to help out, a great way to start, is contribute it to the docs. The community will thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Adriana. And this is the power of community, right? And each and every person can make a difference, right? So all of you, please take time and effort to go to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation kind of forum, be a member of it, be a part of this SKILup sessions, and post on your comments and thoughts. And we hope to see you in the next episode on September 12th, which is on open source software tool integration, which is another important piece. But we really thank everyone from the bottom of our heart who have made this time, and you have also given a shout out to all of us. And keep learning and keep enjoying. Thank you so much, everyone, for a great day and great night. If you're going to be late night for you, Adriana, moving forward. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.